Hit record. There we go. Dr. Wiley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Well, and thanks for this invitation to be with you all. I know I can't really see you, but I see many of your avatars here, some of which are AI generated, some of which are real people, some of which are pets, apparently. Um, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit of work that I've been doing lately. Very early work. I'm very much in gathering feedback mode with this work. Maybe just by word of prelude. Um, it sounds like some of you heard about the cheat benchmark initiative that I soft launched a number of weeks ago, trying to create some energy and momentum around people working to benchmark major large language models to see how willing they are to help students cheat on their homework for some definition of the word cheat. Um, Two things happened shortly after that. First, there's lots of excitement about it. I was telling Brandon that it turned out to be very much like the story of the Little Red Hen. If you know the Little Red Hen story, and if you don't, you can Google it afterward. But lots of people interested in seeing the results of the benchmarking, but no one really stepping up to commit any time or resources to support or help with the benchmarking, not funders, not individuals. So there's a lot of kind of interest, but no collaborators or foundations or anyone step forward. At the same time, another generation of models was released, um, and another generation of open models, not far behind that. And it kind of became clear that a lot of people would like to have that number, but that number, the models are coming so fast that we would be running new benchmarks monthly on new models. It feels like from the frontier providers, and they don't seem to be becoming more disagreeable over time, let's say. Seem like they're wanting to be more helpful over time. So the cheap benchmark, I think, is still an interesting idea. Um, I don't know I don't know where it's going to go because while there was some interest in it, there wasn't material interest in it. So, kind of in response to that myself, and this is now pivoting into the topic of the talk today. I've been thinking about, well, we all have, right? The arms race between students and faculty, which is decades old. Um, they come up with a new way to cheat, and we come up with a new way to catch them. So they come up with a newer way to cheat, so we come up with a newer way to catch them. So they develop an even better way. And it's just this ongoing, I think arms race is actually a good phrase to describe it. And I realized that there's no way that we, as educators, were ever going to compete meaningfully in that arms race with companies that are raising $100 billion at a time in funding rounds, let alone all the open source work that's going on. If you're not familiar with a site called Hugging Face, um, Hugging Face is the place where you can go to see and review and access all of the open source AI models that exist in the world. And you can see right here, 15,000 models plus. Like the idea that there's ever something technologically or that we're going to be able to do to combat cheating using AI, even if we got the big three model providers, like if Gemini and Anthropic and OpenAI all made it so that their models utterly refused to help cheating, you still have 15,000 open source models or fine tunes of models out here in the world. So that stops feeling like it's a very productive path to pursue. So a number of weeks ago, I tried to step back and just ask myself, is there not a way that we can reconceptualize this problem that might like aren't there similar problems in other domains? There must be that have some kinds of solutions that we could learn something from. And so that's the genesis of this working paper that's published on SSRN that you can find pretty easily. But I'll provide a link at the end. I guess a lot of this is what I was just saying. Um, Surveillance tools are failing and failing more, and I am so uncomfortable with the idea of surveilling in the first place. I have huge issues with tools like Turnitin, where we force our students to give up their own copyrighted authored work that they've written to be contributed to a database that's then weaponized against other students. I think that's totally immoral. I'm not a fan of any of the things that are going on over here. And I already talked about how I think the arms race is unwinnable. And so I've been writing for a while about the incentive that students have to cheat. Like, why do they cheat? Maybe if we could go upstream of the arms race instead of trying to say, can we figure out their technique and counter it? Maybe if we worked on the incentive, um, maybe we could make some kind of durable progress there. So as I started thinking about like, if you step back and ask from like the 30,000 foot view, what is the problem that we are up against here? And the problem is that we've got this largish number of people that we need to be honest, but we don't have any way of observing them all the time in order to ensure and guarantee that each of them is honest all the time. And it turns out that that's a problem that happens everywhere. It happens with the IRS wants all of us to be honest when we do our taxes and submit them. Sports bodies want their athletes to not do drugs. They want them to be honest about the fact that they're not doing drugs, but of course they can't be with every athlete every minute of the day. Financial regulation, nuclear proliferation, food safety, right? We want every facility that creates food to follow safety standards. We need them to be honest about the fact that they're doing that, but we cannot be in every one of those facilities every day. So it turns out that having students be honest in their academic work when there's too many of them for us to observe all the time is one problem in a family of problems that actually have a very well-known solution. And so the well-known solution to this is sampling-based deterrence or random audits that have meaningful penalties. And you probably can think of other kind of domains that have the same kind of problem where you've got a bunch of people that you need to keep honest and you can't observe them all to keep them honest. So how do you restructure incentives around them so that it's not worth the risk to cheat? And you just change the incentive. And you'll notice that when it comes to anti-doping or to nuclear verification or whatever it might be, that this says nothing about how the technique that the student might use or that the athlete might use to do drugs or the technique that they might use to do this or the technique that someone might be using to try to cheat on their taxes. It's kind of immune to the technique. And so as we talk about this sampling-based deterrence for cheating, it turns out that this deterrent looks like it works equally well whether they're cheating with AI, whether they're paying their roommate to write a paper for them, whether they're going to a site online where they can find someone else who's posted the assessment and accessing the answers there. It actually is agnostic to how the cheating is being accomplished because it's upstream from the particular method of cheating and it's addressing the incentive further upstream from there. So the core mechanism here is that you'd have, and just let me say that you would not do this process for every 10-point homework assignment that you used in a course. You would do this on things like midterms or I have a whole soapbox about midterms. In the 13 years that I was gone, and now that I'm back in the academy full time, somehow the term mid doesn't mean half anymore. They're like three midterms each semester, and I'm baffled by the idea that we could cut something into quarters and call each of them the middle of the term. Um, but that's just me. Things that are worth major points, like a midterm or a final or a big project that students have, something, that's worth 100 points or a large number of points is what we'd be looking at doing here. You wouldn't you wouldn't use this on a 5 point or a 10 point kind of homework assignment. But the idea is that your students would all do whatever the assessment was. They take the exam or complete the project, and then some percentage of them would be selected to participate in, I don't know what to call it, but for lack of a better term, like a learning audit. And then you get together with them, either via Zoom or face to face, however, like modality wise, however that might work. And you would conduct, some kind of secondary learning screening with the students that were selected for the audit. Um, there has to be, as is the case with an IRS audit or with an anti-doping audit or nuclear arms control, like there has to be a real penalty, like a significant penalty for failing the audit, for it to have the motivational or incentive value that we want it to have. And it's also the case, for reasons that we'll talk about in a few minutes, that if you pass that secondary audit, I think it makes sense for you to earn a couple of bonus points because I've called you up. I've had you participate in some additional exercise. You've done the work. You've demonstrated learning. You've taken some time to do that. So it seems only fair that there be some potential kind of small bonus points available to you in that case. Um, so the game theory of it is not super complicated. There are basically two knobs or dials that you can turn. One of them is the percentage of students that you would audit in the class, and the other is the size of the penalty that a student would incur if they fail the audit. So if we're talking about a 100-point exam or assignment, if all I'm going to do is give you a 0 on that, I'm going to have to audit a large percentage of students that participate in the course. In a class of 30 students, that's doing 8 of these audits at these 2 or 3 big checkpoints along the way in the semester. That's like 25 times higher than the IRS audit rate, right? Which they audit like fewer than 1% of people. But if you can kind of expand the range of what you imagine that penalty might be so that it's not just a 0 on this assignment, but it's another 50 points off of your total grade or another 100 points off of your total grade, 0 on this assignment plus another 50 or 100 point penalty, then as the penalty increases, then the percentage of students that you have to audit goes down to keep the math balanced out so that now I'm not claiming that students are perfectly rational, but in terms of the point at which there's a crossover and it becomes illogical to cheat, where the risk is no longer worth the reward. Um, if if the penalty, and I'm going to assume for the rest of this sharing this idea with you, if the penalty is a 0 on this exam plus another 100 points off of your total grade in the class, then I can audit about an eighth of all the students in this way, which might be 4 of these audits in a class of 30. And then that makes the math work out such that when students understand it's a 0 on this plus another 100 points off the top, and you're going to be randomly audited at multiple points throughout the semester, it just stops making sense for them rationally to engage in that kind of behavior. And there is, if you're familiar with the behavioral economics research, there is some advantage to you as an instructor in being vague about exactly what the rate at which you're auditing is. If you said, I'm going to, audit 1 out of 8 of you, that gives a student some clarity and lets them start kind of doing some of their own game theory around, well, what are the odds of this and that. But if you just say more vaguely on each of the, on the midterm, on the final, and on our big project, a number of you are going to be randomly selected to participate in the secondary audit. The kind of vagueness around the actual rate actually works to your advantage because it's just human nature to overestimate when things are vague. That's kind of a enduring finding of the research out of BE. Now, you don't need to audit every student, of course. If you've got a student who fails the exam, there's no point to include them in the group from which you randomly select who to audit. And as I've been thinking and modeling this, I think it also makes sense to say if you're in a course where you have to receive a C or better grade in order for that course to count toward graduation, then I don't think you need to include students who receive a D on the assessment in your audit pool either. Now, if it's a course where all you have to do is pass, then you probably dip down and include those students that receive a D. But we don't have to include everyone in the class in the pool from which we're going to randomly sample every time. Um, Students coming into it, every student is deterred on the way in because they know if they do well, if they at least do well enough to get credit for the course, that there's a possibility that they might be selected. So that deterrence kind of starts at the front, but then on the back side of it, even though the deterrence applies to all students on the back side of it, you'd only draw from the pool of people who, scored 70 or higher, for example, in a class where students needed a C or better to count that class toward graduation. Um, it is absolutely possible that it's not hard to imagine a scenario where a student who really does know the material gets into that audit experience with you and just chokes, or they're having a bad day, or they're super nervous, or there are a number of reasons why you might get a false positive in that audit. And it seems like the easiest way to handle that is to actually allow students an opportunity to appeal, for a second audit, to come back and say, no, that didn't really represent. I want one more swing at it. You can decide if a student, invokes that second chance and they fail both of them, if the penalty needs to be even more severe, so that you don't have students kind of gaming that. But if the false positive rate is 1 out of 10 on a single audit, if you allow students to do a second audit, you can drop that false positive rate down to 1%. And then as you think about uh, how you structure, um, I'm sorry, not how you structure, but the what it looks like the false positive rate is and how you're trying to turn those knobs and dials around to make the math work out. The the amount of bonus, the number of bonus points that you should award to students in order to counterbalance the chance that there might be a false positive on their audit, kind of moves up and down as well. Um, and I think when I try this in the fall, I'm going to use 5 points as the bonus for anyone who gets selected to do the secondary kind of learning assessment and who passes it. But something in the 3 to 5 point range is enough. Um, okay. I think we're going to have plenty of time for conversation, which I hope is going to be good. Um, so just a couple of additional points. First, just an acknowledgement that students' incentives aren't necessarily linear in terms of the degree to which they're tempted to cheat or not to cheat. They might not be trying to maximize the number of points that they get on an exam, uh, which you might think would be their goal. Is, if I can get 100% on this, of course I want to get 100%. Maybe all they're trying to do is hit that minimum, just kind of get over the cliff of I need to do well enough on this exam that I'm going to get the grade I need in this class in order to progress on toward graduation. Um, so, to account for this nonlinearity, that's why I talked about how we might change who is in the pool that we sample from. But there are other things that we could talk about there if that's something that people are interested in. Um, over here on the right-hand side, in terms of fairness, I'm just talking about false positives. Um, this, this math is true in as much as the audit and then a secondary audit, if a student would ask for one, if those are truly independent events, then this is the math. But if there's some correlation between those, as opposed to them being completely independent, then those numbers would look a little different. So, for example, if you had a student who just suffered from severe anxiety all the time, then the anxiety that caused them to struggle in the first audit might cause them to struggle again in the second audit. But it should also have caused them to struggle on the exam. Um, but in terms of just making sure that everything is fair, we're, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this on a later slide. But we need these audit experiences need to be at least as well structured, as well documented, with rubrics and everything that you would do on the assessment that you're auditing. This can't be a kind of afterthought, sloppily done job. This assessment has to be designed very well, objectively scored to the degree that that's possible, etc. Um, the credibility problem here is it's kind of interesting. If students don't believe that the audits are happening, then the threat of the audit doesn't have any teeth. You also can't stand up, for FERPA reasons. You can't stand up at the front of the room and talk about, by name the people who participated in the audit last week. Um, but it would be nice, and we kind of get into this over here in deterrence, in the decay of deterrence, that it would be important to stand at the front of the room and say something like, had a number of conversations with those of you who are selected for the secondary learning screening or whatever it is that we want to call it. You know, thanks everybody for doing that. Just want folks to know that that really is happening. I'm not going to talk about it because it's not my place, but you might ask around if you want to know who participated and what it was like. Um, so as I said, there are a couple of primary knobs for us to turn. Those are the audit rate and the penalty. Um, our target for false positives, we can get that down below 10% in a single audit and down below 1 with the 2 audit appeal. I mean, no assessment is ever going to be perfect. I mean, 100% would be our ideal goal, but understanding that measurement is noisy for all the reasons that we talk about. In our introductory psychometrics classes, below 1% is as good a target as we can have. And then you can turn up and down this number of mastery points as well. So um, let's just say a few words about design principles here. And maybe the first one, and the one that I'll call out the most on this slide, is that the audit really has to align to the exam objectives. And what you wouldn't want to do is you wouldn't want to have an exam or a project or something that students did where you were really measuring them at Bloom kind of understand levels or Bloom apply levels. And then you come in to do the audit, and the audit is ostensibly on the same topics and same content, but you're actually now asking them to synthesize or evaluate in the audit, which even though it seems like it's still about World War II, it's actually a very different assessment than the assessment that they originally took was. And I think this is the biggest risk, to there be kind of validity problems with the audit, is making sure that the audit stays aligned at the same Bloom level as the original assessment. If you have had a chance to see the paper, you might know that linked in the paper is a link to this interactive simulator. Um, oh, let's see here. We pull this up. This is just kind of a dashboard that you can play around with to say, well, there's 50 students in my class, and the total number of points possible in my class is 750. Um, where do I think that threshold is in terms of You can think of it as where students would score if they were being honest, or you can think of it as the cliff that they're just trying to get over because they need this course to count, toward graduation for them. And then, if they did try to cheat and use AI, where might that score come in? Um, you can turn up and down the penalty that students might face if they're caught. It assumes that they're at least going to get a 0 on that 100-point assignment that they've just cheated on. How many additional points of penalty are there? And then you can see down here at some point, this is the equation showing us where the equilibrium is. You can turn this up until cheating stops being the optimal strategy and being honest becomes the optimal strategy. Um, and if you don't want to play with the points, then you can play with the percentage at which you're auditing. It's just kind of a quick way, instead of having to think about the math and the formulas and things, to be able to play around with the class that you teach. How many students are in it? How many points is it worth? And the number of points that it's worth matters because this penalty, um, students are going to think about that as a percentage of the total points possible in the class. It might be, if there are only 500 points possible in the class and I get audited on a 100-point exam and I lose another 100 points, I'm cooked. Even if I scored 100% on everything else in the course, maybe I can't get the grade that I need, and it means I'm going to fail. Um, so, you can play around with all of these and see how that works out over here on the side. You'll notice that I have not said much at all about the design of the audits themselves. I think that's a secondary question. I didn't address it in the paper, in the working paper, because the goal in the working paper is just to introduce this idea that keeping students from cheating on their assignments is one problem in a family of problems, like keeping people from cheating on their taxes or from doing shortcuts in food processing facilities, or however you want to think about it, that it belongs to that family and that the solution to that family of problems might apply to this problem. That's really the argument I'm trying to make in the working paper. Figuring out the details of how you would do one of these audits um, is only worth thinking about if you believe the premise, right? So in the working paper, I'm just kind of trying to explain the premise that our problem is one of a family of problems. But as I've become more comfortable with this idea and talked to people like at my university's academic integrity office about our policies and how they work and the degree to which a process like this would or wouldn't be compatible with the university's processes, which, as I understand it now, after a really enlightening conversation, it'd be completely compatible with the way that we handle academic dishonesty. Um, Starting to think about how am I going to design these audits for the course in the fall where I'm going to test them. And of course, the delight is in the details, right? So the first couple of things that come to mind are, if this is an exam that had items on it, so if it's math, maybe there are problems that students were working, or it might be a multiple choice quiz that students have taken, that the easiest way to do an audit with them would be to take a subset of the items from the exam and just have students, sit a portion of the exam again, a compressed portion. And it only makes sense to have them take the assessment, retake the items that they got right the first time. There's no point in auditing them on things that they didn't know the first time around. Um, and you don't have to think very hard before you get to the idea that you could build a tool to plug into your LMS to automate this process for you. Um, and yeah, I'm thinking about that. That's one way you could approach exams with items. If it was something more like a piece of written work, like an essay, you could do it manually, or you could use a language model or something else to maybe pull out 5 or 6 interesting vocabulary words that the student used in their writing and just ask them to define those, to give a brief overview of the arguments that they presented in the paper. But again, in this case, where when the original work that you graded was probably graded with a rubric, you're going to need to develop a rubric in support of the secondary learning assessment uh, that you're doing. But again, you have to test the same things in the secondary assessment that you did in the initial assessment. You can't change the Bloom level. You can't change topics. It really has to be a retest to try to verify that students do know at the level that they appeared to know before, um, what they demonstrated in terms of learning on that first assessment. So, um, kind of that's the idea. Um, Again, just to highlight, with this approach, there's no surveillance required. You don't have to use proctoring software. You don't have to use a lockdown browser. You don't have to pretend that AI detectors work. You don't do any of that because you're not in a battle of tactics where my catching you cheating tactic is better than your cheating tactic, because we've just moved upstream of that and kind of changed the incentive. So um, you don't need any of that surveillance. If you think about these kind of sub assessments or these secondary learning assessments as taking 15 or 20 minutes, then this might take an hour of additional time for you after an assessment, maybe up to 2 hours after an assessment, um, in order to ensure that students are getting grades that really reflect what they learn. And then the final point again, that this is it's agnostic of how they go about cheating. It would be as effective for AI powered cheating as it would for roommate powered cheating or purchasing an essay off the internet or whatever it might be. So yeah, so let's all come off, if you're willing and interested. Let's turn our cameras on and unmute and talk about this some. I think Brandon has been. Oh yeah, it looks like there's been some stuff going on in the chat. I think Brandon's been trying to organize that
I have.
in the background. So why don't we start there and then we'll just keep going.
Yeah, and what I'll say is that if I am asking your question, please feel free to turn on your video, come off mute, and clarify. I did copy and paste these, so they are the entirety of questions. And so we started with an audit could it be a concept mastery interview, and maybe model it after a mock interview, but for the subject area?
Yeah, I guess just subject to that one uh, detail that I mentioned a couple of times, that if the assessment, let's just imagine for a minute, maybe it's a foreign language class, and so you've given an assessment, and the assessment, 90% of it is vocabulary. How do I say bathroom? How do I say library? How do I say go? Um, if the original assessment is all kind of Bloom knowledge level assessment, and then you say, okay, for the audit, now actually I'm going to ask you to talk about the relationships between these topics to build a concept map or do something like that. That's a different assessment than the first assessment is. So I think that the real kind of thing we have to take care for here is to really ensure that the second assessment is representative of the first assessment and isn't testing something different. Even though it could be on the same topic, it could still be about the chapter one from the biology text. Um, but there are so many different, if you're familiar with, Bloom's taxonomy, there's so many different levels at which we might work there. Well, and actually, let me step back and just take another minute and tell you a story. A number of years ago, when I was still working with Lumen Learning, which I was full-time faculty for about a dozen years. And then I took a leave from the university and with a friend started this company that uses OER to build online courseware. Some of you might be familiar with, called Lumen Learning. In some of the early work that we did with faculty on assessments, um, we worked with them to develop big pools of assessments. And then we had faculty divide the assessments up into formative assessments, which students would use, to practice and make sure they knew what they needed to know, and then the assessments that we were going to use on the exam. And oh my gosh, particularly the economics faculty were very excited, really engaged. We did this, we rolled it out, and at the just partway through the first semester, watching the data, I could see that students' performance on the formative assessments were not predictive of their performance on the summative assessments. which they should have been. Like if you're doing well on the practice, you should do well uh, on the, when it comes time to actually apply, when it counts. And watching that play out chapter after chapter, I went in and started taking a more critical look at what the faculty had done. And then I went back and talked to some of the faculty and confirmed what I thought I had found, which was that they'd said, well, yeah, we took all the really rigorous, good, hard questions and we put them on the summative assessment, and we left all the like less rigorous, easy ones for them to do for practice. Well, that doesn't prepare them to succeed on the hard, rigorous ones on the exam when all the practice has been softballs and things that are easy. So you really have to ensure that there's not only topical alignment from the initial assessment to the audit or the secondary assessment, but it has to be at the same bloom level. It has to be similar in every way for it to be a true kind of second check of learning and not be a new check of some related thing, but different. Sorry, that was a long rambling answer, Brandon, but
No,
hopefully that
I think
question.
that covered it extremely well. I was actually thinking right before you said you have to have alignment here, and there. I was going to say this goes back to looking at your course for alignment throughout, which is awesome. Jim, it looks like you came off mute. Did you want to ask a question real quick?
Uh, Actually, I just first of all wanted to say thank you. This is brilliant work. And um, are we free to take the tool back to our institutions? That would be enormously valuable.
100%. In fact, the only
Thank you.
thing that, my work from the late 1990s, I've been the open content, open educational resources guy. Everything is openly licensed. The working paper is openly licensed. Simulator is openly licensed. Like, take all of it, however it can be helpful to you, use it. I would ask, not in a way that's enforceable at all, but I would ask that if you do, that you send me feedback. How does it go? How is it received? What did you learn? What did you think was going to work that didn't work? What were you afraid was going to bomb, but it actually turned out okay? Like, I'm still trying to learn my way through this as well. So if you end up using any of these ideas, I I'm like humbled by that. And I've just asked that you'd share what you learn back with me.
Feedback will be is a promise.
Yeah.
No question about that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. Just have to applaud you, Dr. Wiley, on openly licensing your work because that is not extremely common, particularly in academia. So personally, as an open source fan, both with software applications, publications, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna go to a more of a comment, but I think there is a question here inherent in the commentary. Um, and it is, I'm not sure if I'm getting hung up on the word audit itself or not, but while audit-based deterrence has some effectiveness, it's also precariously vulnerable to bias and manipulation, which usually preferences those with privilege. What I get from that is, what are the dangers of discrimination in a system like this?
Yeah. Well, I would say first, if the selection process is truly random, that's the first thing you've got to do. And that's why I'm interested in building a tool to just automate it inside the LMS for me. If the selection process is truly random, and then if the scoring of the assessment is either truly objective or as objective as it can be made, then the secondary assessment is no more and no less, open to issues uh, with bias, say, for example, than any of the other assessments that we use in our courses are. We do have a tendency as higher ed people, those who have no hair or gray hair, like I do, will remember in the late 1990s, as we started talking about moving our classes online, there was a huge uproar from some portion of the faculty, um, laying out all the standards that an online course should have to meet to be able to be offered as an official course by your university. The problem is that if you turned around and applied those standards to any of the face-to-face teaching that was happening, no courses on campus would be able to be offered because there is this incredible double standard that had been set up for online courses that they were supposed to need to meet that wasn't applied to our face-to-face teaching. And so I think we ought to always look at new things coming along as opportunities to improve and opportunities to do better. Um, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that it's fair to hold a secondary assessment to a higher level of, being immune to whatever kind of construct irrelevant measurement error you're talking about, whether it's bias or something else. If it meets the same degree of quality as the original assessment, which by the way, the original assessment is the assessment that, 7 out of 8 students are going to get their grade for, even in this scenario where we're doing the audits. Um, so it seems like as long as the secondary assessment is at least as objective and bias free as that initial assessment, that we ought to do okay.
Thank you, Jim.
But as a person who
Oh,
did their PhD in education and used to teach assessment design and measurement design, like, do I wish all of our assessments were more effective and had less bias and less other kinds of construct irrelevant noise in them? Heck, yes, I do. But I wish I got paid more too. So
oh, Jim, go
Yeah,
ahead.
thank you. I want to respond to the point you mentioned about objectivity and also to Chris Luke's comment about validation. My comment is actually about reliability, going back to your earlier point about offering the audit in a different type of assessment. So one of the reasons that we do that, though, is because reliability from type to type is not 100%. If it were, then it wouldn't matter.
yeah.
However, what you've got to do is balance that, right? And so I'm not saying it shouldn't be objective. I'm saying we probably need to think that through. And again, it's not going to be
Mhm.
perfect, but
Yeah.
if you have something that as an alternative, I think we have to use our judgment and say we think this is a valid assessment, but we're looking at reliability and we don't really want 100% reliability. I guess maybe we would want 100% reliability, but we know it's not going to be there. In fact, the whole premise of offering the different type of assessment is that it's not 100% reliable, and we don't want that. But I don't think we want zero.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of talking about test retest reliability, right? So for just for 30 seconds of vocabulary, right?
Yeah,
Validity is the degree to which the assessment instrument actually measures the thing that you want
right.
it to measure, right? And Jim, it sounds like you know this, but I'm just saying for the for the good of the order. And reliability is that the same instrument can get the same measure out of people time after time,
Right.
right? So you want your test to both actually represent what people know, and you want it to give you the same score whether they take it on Monday morning or Friday night or whatever. So those are the two kinds of things that we talk about with assessment. Um, and it was actually thinking about kind of test retest reliability that made me, and when I was sharing my initial thoughts about how it might work, if you've given an exam or some kind of assessment with multiple items on it, if you just look at the items that students got correct and then ask them to retake those same items, like that's the ultimate. You're actually using the same instrument that you used. It's literally the same instrument that you used before.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting approach. It also saves you time because you're not developing a second instrument. Um, so I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity or potential there. I haven't tried it myself yet, so I can't tell you that I know that it works. But for those kinds of assessments, I think that's what I will try to do um, in the fall. And then for ones that are more subjective, that you're scoring with a rubric, Um, I think there are some interesting approaches that we could talk about there. I'll just share that there's some really interesting work out of Google um, recently, and I'll find it in a minute and share it in the chat. Um, but looking at the degree to which large language models can be made to faithfully score things with rubrics. And what the researchers at Google found was that if instead of having four categories, on each category it's either exemplary or satisfactory or emerging or missing or like whatever that is, um, that distinction between that gradation of what's exemplary versus satisfactory is actually, it's kind of hard for people to make.
Yeah.
It's also hard for models to make. What they found that is if you take that matrix and you break it into a number of statements where you can say, was this present or absent in the work? Like, what was it present? Yes or no? Was this present? Yes or no? Did this happen? Yes or no? That not only can humans grade that with greater iterator reliability, but the models can grade it with much greater accuracy and iterator reliability with humans too. So my temptation for fall is to develop some rubrics like that, score it myself, score it with a model, and just make sure that I'm not up in the night, that I've got some kind of iterator reliability on the side there. Actually, the link I'm going to put in the chat, sometime before the end of this month, Lord willing, a week from Monday, there's a book, an edited book that I've been working on for the last several months. It's a chapter book with chapters by different groups of authors. And each chapter starts with a particular evidence-based teaching practice or instructional design approach. And it reviews the research to establish that, in fact, it is an evidence-based practice. And then it goes into describing an iterative process that the authors use to turn that process into a prompt that a large language model could enact. And then they talk about their approach to evaluating the degree of fidelity with which the model enacted the evidence-based teaching practice and revisions that they made to the prompt. And then the full prompt is appended at the end of the chapter. And the whole book is openly licensed, CC BY again. So that if you've been looking for research-based kind of iteratively designed and validated prompts that you can use in support of your teaching and learning, this will be an open collection of those that you can use and reuse. So if you watch the promptbook.org, the title of the book's The Pedagogical Prompt Book. And it hasn't been updated in a while because I think it still says that the book will be released in the middle of March, which obviously we have missed at this point, but sometime in the next week or two, we're almost there. And that research, the research from the group at Google about rubric redesign is discussed in the book. So I'll just leave you with that link.
Awesome. So I just want to say thank you again, Dr. Wiley. Thank you everyone who attended. We do have some concurrent sessions coming up at 10 o'clock. So I want to make sure that we give those folks an opportunity for participants. But I do wonder, I have two more questions from chat. Do you have time to answer those as people are flowing in and out so we can have a record of them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And I've just dropped my email address in the chat as well. Please feel free to send me questions, comments, hatred, whatever this presentation made you feel, let me know.
Okay, so, and I think these might be relatively quick questions, but may, open Pandora's box.
I'll be
Uh,
brief.
so, the first one is if it's random, which this is the selection of students for an audit. If it's random, how do you ensure that all students at some time during the term go through the check, or does that matter?
You don't, and you don't want to, because if you had a system where everybody knew that they're going to get picked at some point, once you get picked, then after that, you're like, well, I've already been picked. I don't have to worry about it. I can cheat from here to the end of the term. This is sampling with replacement, as we call it, right? Once I pull your marble out, Brandon, your marble goes back in the bag and you might get pulled out next time. So some students might get selected every single time. Some will never get selected. But it's the randomity of it that really creates the deterrence effect.
So the next one
Randomity,
is
is that a word? Randomness? I'm not sure what the right word is. Sorry.
so the other one is focused more on the assessment piece of it, but along the same line. So I wonder if the assignments that get audited should be truly random, or if those assignments where cheating is suspected, or you've observed in the past, are the ones that should be audited, or does it matter?
Well, if it's truly random, then everybody has to worry about it, right? If there's some process by which selection happens and you learn what that process is, then you can game the process to decrease the likelihood that you're going to be selected, right? Now, I can imagine, if students have been scoring 65, 70, 75 all along, and then on the midterm they get a 98, you might say, well, maybe they should get, maybe they should be a little extra random in how we, choose them. Um, but I don't really know that that's true. I think the power of it being completely random, um, I think it's easy to overestimate how powerful that is. Um, but I mean, this is the fourth time somebody has suggested that to me, right? Like, shouldn't we use evidence to weight the likelihood that people get drawn more or less? I'm not convinced yet. That doesn't mean that it's not true, because I mean, I haven't tried this even the first time yet, right? I just published the working paper a couple of weeks ago. I'll do this for the first time in the fall. Um, but somebody else who's on the call might try it in a summer class or in a fall class and do it that way. Change the weighting of how likely you are to get drawn by how different your score on this assessment is, from the average of all the other scores that you've received before. But maybe that just encourages you to cheat on everything, the homework, the 10-point stuff, so that everything looks consistent. See, that's the point. The point is, once you know what the rule is, then you can start gaming the rule to try to decrease the chance that you get caught. I really don't think there's a better algorithm than just purely random.
And so if you're looking at that purely random, does it apply to only students, or is it those more summative assessments? Is it the more high stakes, or do you look at your portfolio of assessments in the course and randomly choose some throughout in order to increase that randomness of your audits?
Yeah, I would hope that the point values of your assessments were correlated with how important it was that students knew the things on those assessments. That's ideal. If that's not the case, then we should all have a talk. Um, but I really can't imagine going through this process more than 2 or 3 times a semester. And for something that's worth, like I said, I have a weekly homework thing I have students do where they have a conversation with an AI model using a prompt I give them, and they submit the transcript of their conversation before class. That's how I know that they've read before they come to class. They get 10 points for it. I'm never going to do this process for that. I'm going to do it for the midterm. I'm going to do it for the final. I'm going to do it for the big project that they submit at the end of the semester. So it does take extra time on your part, but you probably have 2 or 3 assignments that make up 2/3 or 3/4 of the points in your class anyway. Like that's where I would focus.
All right, thank you. And we have enough time for folks to get to our 10 a.m. session. So I can't express my gratitude enough for you coming, for you presenting your work, for answering our questions and being so gracious with both your time, your expertise, and um, even being here in the first place. So, Kay, do you have anything to add?
I was going to say it's wonderful. And you're right, Dr. Wiley. The whole time you were talking, I'm thinking about how do I game the system?
Yep.
Like how would I go about gaming the system? So I think you made loads of points. on how true randomness has to be there, because otherwise, yeah,
Yeah.
we have students who, like kind of do pointification, like how many points so I can get the C, how many points to the A, and I am
Yeah.
amazed at some of my students who are really good at that, who just put in just that amount of work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I want to say thank you to you guys too. I was telling Brandon before, this is the first conference presentation that
Oh,
I've given about the paper. And so selfishly, it's great for me to have another chance to talk through it, to hear your questions, to think about how to answer them, to hear that same issue come up for the fourth time and really have to
mhm.
reconsider it again. Um, so, thank you guys for the opportunity and for the questions and the answers, and just good to be with you.
And thanks for everybody who came and still stuck around too. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
so this is our last day of the conference. So we're going to say goodbye now, and we'll get this recording up pretty quickly.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks,